Chapter 7 of Yurugu. This book it's a big old book, man. It's a big book. At times it's a tough read. Marimba Ani is a very meticulous writer. She's a very thorough thinker and a very meticulous writer. And it really comes across in chapters like this one. I'll be honest, there's some parts of the chapter where she's going so deep into kind of like the academic conversations and academic discussions around some of the concepts that sometimes I must hold my hand up to say I did kind of skip a few paragraphs because I wasn't so interested at this point in understanding how different European scholars, relate to some of these ideas. There's lots of discussion there about Freud. There's lots of discussions in there about, different conservative and liberal scholars and how they, Marimba Ani does a really good job in showing how, despite the superficial differences between the liberals and the liberals and the conservative scholars, basically they're united in their belief in, the ideals of Western thought and so on. And Marimba Ani kind of takes time to kind of lay that out before debunking them. So some of the chapter I did skip over, but without further ado, let me pull out the things that for me really stood out in this chapter. And so her purpose in this chapter, last time round in the previous chapter that we did, we talked about the rhetorical ethic. Marimba Ani broke down how the Europeans use rhetorical ethics, which is basically words, lovely, great, swelling, fabulous words, talking about things like love and peace and universalism and love thy neighbor. A lot of it, of course, filtered through religion. So a lot of that love your neighbor, pray for your enemies and all that. Marimba Ani argues that Europeans use those so-called ethics to bamboozle and trick others, basically. So those ethics are actually, and she talks a little bit about that in this chapter, those so-called ethics about love your neighbor and that sort of stuff are actually meant to for export. Those are exports for the Europeans. They're designed to export to the likes of I and I, you and me and us and our people, and to make us think that that's how we should behave toward Europeans. Basically, that's what the rhetorical ethic is. So she goes through and she talks about how hypocrisy is at the heart of European behavior, thought, particularly in regards to non-Europeans. Now, in this chapter 7, Marimba Ani is going to talk about the actual ideals, the actual values that actually shape European behavior. So in chapter 8, she's going to go and talk about the actual values that shape how Europeans behave toward non-Europeans. But in this chapter, she talks about the values that dictate and determine how Europeans relate to Europeans and what motivates their behavior toward each other. And it should come as no surprise to anybody that one of the most important things concepts that are at play here that determine European behavior toward other Europeans is individualism. Individualism. And this is on page 339. She talks about individualism, and she makes the point that usually when academics talk about individualism, they talk as if 16th and 17th century scholars like John Locke are the ones who, maybe even Hume and maybe Adam Smith and people like that. Usually those are the people that you hear talked about with regard to individualism. And the idea that we're given is that, that's where individualism kind of started, was in the 16th, 17th century, the rise of capitalism and so on. But Marimba Ani says, again, as usual, throughout the whole book, she makes the point that John Locke and all of these people, really what they did, they refined what had been laid already in the Utamawazo, the culturally structured thought of the Europeans. John Locke and so on, Adam Smith and whatnot, they just refined what the likes of Plato and Aristotle and others had already laid out, had already put forth, 2,500, 3,000 years previously. So this individualism is something that goes real deep down into the makeup, real deep down into the thoughts, the mindset of the Europeans. And Marimba Ani argues that it was Plato who established the grounds for rampant and deeply ingrained individualism, as we're going to see in a minute. Peace out to you, Everything is Politics. Nice to catch you here. I'm glad you're able to join us as well at this time of the day. Love and appreciate you and everyone else who's in the stream as well, in the lives as well. Let us know you're here if you want to. It'd be good to know where you're at and where you're listening from or watching from. So Plato, individualism. We know what Plato's idea of the self was, this detached self that is the mind that is detached from even one's own emotions and one's own body, but also, most importantly, detached from other people, but also the rest of the cosmos, nature. Everything else has got to be detached from this self, and only the self can truly know, and the way that the self knows is through logical, rationalistic inquiry, and so on. So we know that from previous chapters. What we learn here in this chapter from Marimba Ani is that she brings out how self-interest is a necessary result of Platonic thought, of the epistemology of Plato. So in Platonic thought, seeking one's self-interest is the key to existence, basically. And this, we should know about this, because this is capitalism. This is the ideology of capitalism. But the ideology of capitalism built on the ideology of Plato from 3,000 years ago. And then there's a very interesting section on page 341 where Marimba Ani points out that in Plato's conception, happiness is defined as seeking one's own self-interest. So on page 341, we see this. In Plato's day, there may have been only an inconsequential number of people capable of conceiving in this way, in this Platonic way. But the layers thickened and grew until it became characteristic of the culture bearers and the ordinary people of the culture. Now, Europeans are almost born with a concept of themselves as housing a distinct psyche, necessarily isolated from all others, and as being responsible only to themselves. This conception is inculcated at a very early age. What followed from this Platonic conception was the concept of a rationalistic ethic, which along with secularization, provided the basis for an individualistic conception or misconception of human happiness. If all of these related epistemological premises were valid, then it followed that the individual herself had to determine what was in her interests, i.e., what made her happy. Self-interest in this way becomes paramount, and freedom is then the ability to pursue this self-interest. So we definitely see, we see that. That's basically the dominant mode of thought in today's politics, economics, and so forth, is this idea that the driving force of society, the thing that will make people happy and thus make societies functional and happy, is for each individual, because the individual is everything. The individual is the core component of any society. Is if the individual seeks out its self-interest, defined as something separate, purely their own self-interest, something that's separate from everybody else. That's the ideological. That's the thought. That's the ultima waza of European thought, as laid out by Plato. Now, obviously, lots and lots of things follow on from that kind of concept. One of which is a deep, and we all know this. Many of the things that Marimba Ani talks about in this chapter, I just feel like she's describing my life, or she's describing the life of most of the people around me. It is obviously for us, those of us who are living in Babylon, living in Europe and other European dominated societies, everything that you read in this chapter should resonate with you, particularly if you're someone who's somewhat critical of these kinds of ways of, these Eurocentric ways of being. So she says on page 351, she argues that European culture creates, I can read it on here. European culture creates a being who thrives on competition and therefore on individual and distinct achievement. Because there is not a natural regard for personal worth born from or supported by the culture, because a person's existence as a member of the group does not in itself mean much in European culture, the individual strives to be better than, to stand apart from others in his cravings for recognition. And ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? Obviously, it's very, what's the word? Exaggerated in this day and age. In 2023 here, the social media age, the internet age, and so on and so forth. This is really exaggerated, but that is basically it. When you think about, for example, what someone's idea of a good life is, what someone's idea of success, what are our ideas of living a bona fide human life, it is in these things, isn't it? It's about achieving. It's about standing out. I need to make a name for myself. I need to leave a mark on history. I need to, do you know what I mean? I need to, all these kinds of things. And Mama Marimba Ani is kind of showing us that that inclination to want to do these things is dictated or is driven by a need to be valued, by a desire to be valued, to feel valued and to be valued, to have a sense of personal worth. Now, in our cultures, obviously, in African cultures and other first world cultures, if you want to say it, original peoples, majority peoples, it's the complete opposite, isn't it? It's Mama Marimba Ani, there's a phrase she has somewhere in this chapter where she says something like, the essence of the human spirit is communalism. And in our cultures, in our traditional cultures, you are valued because you are, frankly, you're a member of the community, you're in the community, that's your value, that's where your value comes from. You don't have to prove yourself to the community, you don't have to prove yourself to anybody else. You don't have to get any objects to say, look, I'm amazing, value me. You're valued because you are who you are. You just are. And people talk about Ubuntu, in the southern African region, Ubuntu as one of the terms for this conception of I am because we are, and I am valued because we are, and I'm a member of the community. And one of the things, I was having a conversation with my oldest son the other day, and we were talking about, I was explaining to him that in some society, here we have to pay money for somewhere to live. We have to pay money to have a home. And if you don't pay money to have a home, you'll have no home, And I contrasted that with the fact that in our traditional situation back home in Uganda and elsewhere, it's completely different to that. You have a home because you are a member of the community, and that's a manifestation of the different concepts of value. In European culture, value comes from standing out, doing stuff. You have to do something. You have to prove that you have worth. Whereas in our cultures, you have worth just because who you are. And then the next, the follow-on point from this, which Marimba Ani, breaks down, is that I think we talked about this last time as well, but in the European asili, which is the ideological core, and then as laid out by the modes of cognition, the modes of thinking, culturally structured thought, which is the utama wazo, and also the utama rojo, energetic drive, they all kind of work together. Within this European asili, there's no actual mandate for altruism. There's no mandate for altruism, Marimba Ani argues, in this individualistic, self-interest, dominated setup. So she says on page 300 and that same section, 351, she's talked about how the individual is always striving to be better than, to be, stand apart and so on. Then she says, this serves to reinforce his separate awareness and to further decrease his ability to identify with others. He, least of all, can define his goals, his good or his goals in terms of universal harmony. This is the European. Can't define their good or their goals in terms of universal harmony. It should be even clearer now that there is no supportive mechanism or precedent for an altruistic ethic or spirit of universal brotherhood. The only thing that binds members of the culture together in the final analysis, that binds them into a unified cultural whole, is the common goal of the suppression, exploitation, and control of the rest of the world, the environment, the earth, and its people, that which is other than the cultural self. It is, and she ends, it is a union of like-minded people who have cooperated in the creation of a technological giant or monster. So, altruism in the European asili, altruism really isn't supported. There's no grounds for altruism. We see the grounds for altruism in the culture, other cultures, first world cultures, because our cultures are all predicated and based on the unity of all, the interconnectivity with all, and that's laid out in how we behave toward each other, how we behave to the planet, and so on and so on. You know, harmony is the name of the game, and value and worth and purpose and all that sort of stuff comes from that blending and interweaving between the different elements of the cosmos. But in the European asili, in the European case, because of the concept of the self and all that sort of stuff, and the objectification of everything else, there is really no grounds for altruism. If you're being altruistic in the European setting, you're doing so in contradiction to the European cultural asili. So Marimba Ani then spends quite a bit of time talking about this concept of freedom. Freedom. She touched on it there. You know, this concept of, basically freedom being the ability to do whatever the hell you want to do. And she talks about this. She breaks down how in the European, on page 344, this mainly is. She breaks down how the European concept of freedom is about the ability to. It's about freedom from constraints, freedom from entanglements to culture, freedom from entanglements to tradition, freedom from relying or reliance on or dependency on or being dependency on other people, on nature, on whatever it might be. That's freedom from connections. So you recall that in the earlier chapters, Marimba Ani talks a fair bit about how in ancient Greece, the pre-Platonic era was dominated by Homer, the poet Homer, and Plato and subsequent Platonic thinkers really denigrate that era because they felt that Homer had these poems and these epics which would be read out and performed, and the people would identify with the protagonists, and that identification of people with the protagonist was seen as weakness, because in Plato's idea, identification with others was weakness, and real freedom is about complete detachment. The individual, the self, must be independent, must be completely and utterly independent, not in any way shaped, not in any way moved by even their own feelings, even moved by its own emotions and so forth. Peace and blessings to you, Leah Boggs. Nice to see you on board. Glad you can make it at this time as well. And you said it's about individual freedom, not the collective, right? This is the thing, and you see it in today's conversations with regard to things like capitalism and socialism. The idea of communists and socialists that the collective is important, the community is important, and you can probably differentiate between collective and community. If you say the community that takes precedence over the individual, that's seen as no, this is tyranny and so on. It's communism, and it's almost just, you can just say that and it's a given. People will take that and as a strong argument that you shouldn't, the interest of the community shouldn't outweigh the interest of the individual. It should be the other way around. And that's actually seen as like a very, very strong argument because this ideology is so strong. But then Marimba Ani talks about power and how this concept of freedom is about power over. And she talks about how, first of all, this is about power over on an interpersonal basis, power over other people, but also on a collective basis. And this is where the imperialism comes in, power over other peoples. So on page 344, Marimba Ani writes that the concept of freedom that Lee describes here in its positive implications, i.e. as value, has nothing to do with the ability, i.e. the lack of constraining forces to do. This freedom has to do with the ability, lack of constraining forces to do. So freedom is about the lack of constraints on the individual. This freedom is the existential prerequisite to individual power, and that is its significance for understanding the European mind and European cultural behavior. Power, as a European concept, is the ability to control and to manipulate, control of the self in order to control and manipulate objects external to the self. One must be a free agent, free in the interest of self. This also implies freedom from moral or ethical considerations. This concept of power is synonymous with the European ultima rojo, the European energy, the energetic drive, the thing that drives Europeans. It is the most basic motivating force in the culture, touching every aspect of belief and behavior. Within European societies, that is, between European peoples, the individual is the seat of this power, just as he is the seat of the freedom that makes it possible. He is free to wheel and deal, to maneuver, operate, procure, achieve, etc. for self. And then interculturally, the entire culture bands together expertly in group effort to ensure its power over other cultures. So the concept of freedom in European culture is all about power over, and freedom from constraints and power over the other people, and on an individual basis. Even power over your own body, your emotions, but and then certainly the thing that binds them together is the power over others. And we're going to come back. I'll come back to that point about power over others in a little while. But one thing I just want to say here is that Marimba Ani says on page 345, briefly, I presume she's going to come back to this in more detail at some other place, but she says very briefly, talking about the African concept of the power in African ontological concepts, whereby, quote, the person has their own power or force by virtue of being part of the cosmological whole. So in an African-centered ideology, power is not an individual thing that is only about the self over others. Our power comes from our interconnectivity with the cosmos, and it's not about power over the cosmos. It's about, I suppose, power with the cosmos. Amos Wilson has the first few chapters of Amos Wilson's book, The Blueprint for Black Power, are all about different concepts of power. And I must go back to that book at some point, because I find it quite fascinating to think about the different types of power and which types of power we as African people should be trying to, develop when we're talking about Black power, African power. So thanks everyone who's in the chat, by the way. Please do make sure that you, or in the watching the stream, make sure that you share, please like the video, share it. And if you would like to sign up for the email alerts, then just go to eliewananda.substack.com and sign up there, so you get all the videos posted through your door, electronic door, on a weekly basis. So one thing that Marimba Ani said, which was quite powerful for me, she speaks about how the European concept of self is a very rigid and a very flat concept in comparison with other peoples, particularly other first world original peoples like Africans. one of the things she says is that the European concept of self rests on the concept of contradiction. She says on page 345, the self cannot be both self and other. The self excludes the other. And you see this when you delve into this sort of stuff, this European thought, you see loads of dichotomies, mind, body, reason, emotion, male, female, native, whatever, all these dichotomies. It's all about strictly demarcating everything. Everything has to be completely separate from everything else. And Marimba Ani said something here, which is interesting. She talks on page 349 about how, I'll quote it. She's talking about someone called Dorothy Lee, and she says that Lee makes some observations about the relationship of the self to that which the self experiences. Here, and Marimba Ani says, here again, we see the tyranny of Aristotelian logic and epistemology over the European mind and the consistently limiting effects of this absolutism on conceptual possibilities. Now, bear with me here. I think I get what Marimba Ani is saying here. She's basically, as she has done one or two times in the earlier parts of the book, she's trying to get us to recognize that our conception of what actually exists, what there is in existence, is constrained by what we think by what we think about what is in existence, and how if we've got this concept of very distinct things, like there's a self here and there's others here and there's this and there's that, then you're going to have difficulty to perceive any other kinds of being that might not be, so strictly delineated by, this is just one individual person, there's this other individual person, if that makes sense. But I'll let Marimba Ani say it here. So she quotes from that Dorothy Lee saying this, that linguistic analysis shows us a different relationship between the self and reality in general from that which is basic to European culture. The Wintu, which is a people, I don't know who these people are, but the Wintu never asserts the truth as absolute as we do when we say it is. According to Lee, the Wintu say, quote, I think it to be bread, unquote, or something with similar implications rather than it is bread. And then back to Lee. The statement is made about the other, the bread, but with the implication that its validity is limited by the specified experience of the speaker. For us, that which we sense or know, according to man-made rules of logic, is. And that which is beyond my apprehension, beyond my sensing or cognition, is fiction. That is, it is not. The self is the measure of all things. Art and metaphysics and religious experience are barely tolerated on the fringes of our culture. Mysticism is defined negatively as loss of self, and no one in ecstasy is taken seriously until he comes to his senses. Only when the self is logically and cognitively in control is experience valid. And except in the arts and religion, only that which is ultimately open to such experience is true. And that there is something that I want to really study in probably maybe even the next book or one of the next books that we're going to talk about. Really look into this this whole point, this whole area of ontology and epistemology, and how we are limited, how what we think exists, isn't necessarily what exists, if that makes sense. Because if we're only limiting ourselves to being able to perceive what is out there through rationalistic inquiry, through logical inquiry, through maybe even verbal discourse and all that kind of stuff, regimented kind of ways of thinking and relating, then of course we're going to miss. And an obvious example of this is, I always make this example, but an obvious example of this is ancestral communion. You know, if you think that, you know, it's only through rationalism and all that sort of stuff that you can perceive what is actually in existence, then of course you're not going to be able to engage with the ancestors, because my understanding is that the ancestors generally don't, you know, aren't about sitting down and writing books and you know, this sort of stuff. It's something that it requires us to get out of the normal modes, these Western normal modes of thinking, and to transcend, to get into other realms of being and existence, to be able to perceive these, you know, these other things. But it's a hypothetical, well, it's a theoretical thing for me, but at the moment, because I am very regimented and very kind of, you know, rationalistic in the way that I think, frankly. But I just wanted to, I enjoyed this. And Marimba Ani says that, you know, she stated many times in the rest of the book that the European concepts, this Platonic thought and so on, shuts one off from the cosmos, which means actually shutting them off from vital sources of meaning and knowledge and truth. And this, of course, atrophies the European emotionally, spiritually, whatever, physically, and so on and so forth. And then this is now where we start for the rest of the this discussion. We'll now talk a little bit more about the manifestations of these key philosophical underpinnings of European thought. So one of the things she says quite dramatically is that the European is actually left finding it very, very difficult to love. Very, very difficult to love. And, you know, I mean, I suppose this shouldn't be a surprise, but due to the lack of love in these Western societies that we live in. But it's just very interesting to hear Marimba Ani kind of lay it out. So on page 394, Mama Marimba Ani says this. She says, if the ability to love is predicated on the capacity of the the ability to love, where is it? 394. It's the ability to love. Where is it? Yeah, sorry, on the identity. Okay, there we go. If the ability to love is predicated on the capacity of identifying self with other, so that's important. The ability to love is predicated on the capacity of the identifying self of identifying self with other, i.e., love requires the self to identify with the other. Then it is clear from this discussion that European culture does not provide a basis for the love experience. Instead, it imposes an utamawazo that inhibits and devalues identification and emotional participation, and an ethic that complements and is consistent with this cognitive structure. We have come a full circle to Plato. For him, knowing was more important than loving, and to know meant knowing as object, something separate and distinct from self. Europeans perhaps do not love themselves and have no basis from which to love others. And then it carries on page 395. The European mind struggles to find rational means to synthesis, to joining together, because of the individualism and all that stuff. And she says, however, and this is good, because, you know, sometimes it's good to not constantly be talking about Europeans all the time. So she says it is the genius of African and majority cultures that their utamawazos implicitly reconcile dichotomies that for the European are inevitably irreconcilable. Through the spiritualistic modalities of ritual and ancestor communion, through the sacralization of life, they achieve what rationalistic theories cannot offer. It is by employing the modes of participation and identification, by conceiving of the self as properly joined with other, indeed as defined in terms of other, and by valuing emotional response to that unity and harmony, conceiving of the self as properly joined with other, indeed as defined in terms of other, and by valuing emotional response that unity and harmony are achieved. Ambivalence and ambiguity only become frightening and culturally destructive in the European context, which cannot deal with paradox. Majority cultures contain sophisticated mechanisms that turn these dimensions of human experience into yet another means of uniting people spiritually. And so, yeah, I see what she means. I see what she means. All these things she's talking about with regard to the concept of the self as being separate, necessarily separate, detached from, superior to, and so on, other. And this idea that if you connect with other, if you join with other, if you identify with the other, then you're weak and all this kind of stuff. That's something to be denigrated. That means that you are unable to love. How can you love if you can't identify with other? How can you love if you can't commune with other? How can you love if you don't, if you can't emotionally connect with other? And Marimba Ani makes the point there that, in our cultures, traditionally in other cultures, the societies were set up for that communion, were set up for that connection, and thus love. They could love, we could love, our people could love. Our societies were driven, determined by love in a way that European societies could not, and cannot to this day be determined by love, because they can't love. For them, love equals giving up control over emotions. So there's even a sense in which the idea of love is something to be frowned upon in European culture, actually. And then she says on page 39, she says a couple of things on page 397 about love that tell you quite a lot about what Plato and those guys were all about and where they were headed with this concept. First of all, this idea that love is abstract. So yes, here. It's here. So on page 397, the love that Plato talks about is without human meaning, of course, because human meaning comes from what? From connection. Human meaning comes from community. It comes from cultural interrelatedness. It comes from relating to the cosmos and so on. That's where meaning comes from. Without those connections, you have no meaning. You have no morality, actually. And that's the point that Marimba Ani makes, is that European culture, there is no morality. There is no true morality. There are morals, quote unquote, but those morals are basically that anything goes in the service of one's own self-interest, And so Plato's concept of love is without human meaning. It is an abstract and philosophical ideal. And I'll come to these comments in a second as well. Some fabulous comments in the chats here. So I'll take a break and we'll get onto that. How do I get rid of this thing now? There we go. Hide that. So Plato's concept of love, this philosophical abstract idea. In the Symposium, male homosexual love between a philosopher, i.e. a mentor, and a youth, quote unquote, which is a student, is the closest human relationship to ideal love, quote unquote, since it most approximates the love of truth. That's from Symposium, page 184. This is a text by Plato. Love is the beautiful and the good, 206. And Diotima tells Socrates that the mysteries of love involve moving from the concrete to the abstract, from the particular to the universal, and finally to the realm of forms. And this is a quote from this Symposium. Being not like a servant in love with beauty of one youth or man or institution, himself a slave, mean and narrow-minded, but drawing towards and contemplating the vast sea of beauty, he will create many fair and noble thoughts and notions in boundless love of wisdom, until on the shore he grows and waxes strong, and at last the vision is revealed to him of a single science, which is science of beauty everywhere. Okay, that was a quote from this Plato text, which I didn't understand. Sorry, I shouldn't have bothered reading that. But going on, ordinary love is problematical. So sorry, just to say that point there about mentors and their students. It's come up once or twice before in some of our conversations about pederasty in ancient Greece, and pederasty being sexual relationships between male adults and male juniors. And the Marimba Ani said something in one of the chapters saying that she said even in that culture, even women were so denigrated, they were just basically seen as nothing, and they weren't even seen as being worthy to be objects of love for men. And she just left it there. But now she kind of breaks it down a little bit more, that you see that that this Plato, anyway, you see where pederasty seems to be a manifestation of this concept of love as outlined by Plato as being this abstract, weird, inhuman concept of love, basically. And then just to finish off this little section, bringing it back into today's context, ordinary love is problematical in European culture. What this means is that in order for an individual who has been socialized in the European tradition to act with love, she must overcome her traditions, which are powerful. She must overcome the ontological, epistemological presuppositions, with which she has been inculcated, and the constraints of social institutions that surround her. She will then risk being unsuccessful, as success in European culture depends on competitiveness and aggression, not love. And she will find herself surrounded by individuals who dare not return her love. So, yeah, loveless. People talk about loveless marriages. European societies are loveless societies, almost by definition, because love is shut off from them because of their ultima wazo. Anyway, let's go through some of these comments then, and then we'll go back. We'll go back to the text. So, rice and butter, peace, and blessings to you, rice and butter. Thank you for joining us at this later hour. Really good to have you on board. Leah Boggs, peace and blessings to you. Nice to see you. And we have this. Leah Boggs wrote, we can also see this in the push for us to see the individual achievements and petty bourgeois power gains as a metric to show the great majority of us are doing well. Yeah, exactly. So when Jay-Z is doing well, it's a gain for us all. When one black person is elected, then we collectively have gained some power. Yeah, and I mean, when I was doing a reading on this for this, sorry, I kept thinking about these, people like me, frankly, but it's kind of middle class, making it in the corporate world or making it in whatever, employment world. And, we are all driven by this, we're driven by that. We want to be Jay-Z. We want to be whoever it is. I don't know. We want to take our place amongst the so-called successful Africans who have made it, because we think that is what success is all about. That is what power is all about. But yeah, thank you, Leah. Tito District, peace. Good to see you on board. And then everything is politics. You riffed on what Leah said, and you said it also explains our reverence for nature. For example, we lived in harmony with nature, while Europeans clearly struggle with that. Although interestingly, you said loved in harmony with nature. That's probably your ancestors were speaking through you there, because it is love with nature, isn't it? It's being in love with nature, connecting. If you see love as connection and identification, then yeah, it is about living in harmony with nature. And it's absolutely a real struggle for Europeans and people with a European mindset to live in harmony with nature. Because why would you? Nature is other. Nature must be dominated and controlled. You should read some of the stuff from Descartes, René Descartes, and some of the stuff. I remember I was reading a book by Vandana Shiva. I can't remember what the book was called, but she's this Indian academic who talks a lot about nature and how nature is a battleground for culture and politics and ideology. And she gives some really good analysis of René Descartes' idea of nature, basically as Descartes and others basically looked at nature as being this thing that needed to be imprisoned and then tortured to extract what you needed from it. That's like, it sounds bizarre, but there's like some text where that's what he or someone like that is saying, that, and that's what drives the scientific method for Europeans with regard to, you know, that's why, for example, you can have animal testing, I would say. I'm just gonna throw it out there. Of course, animal testing will be rampant because these little mice are just lots more stuff to use to get knowledge out of, you know, and that's how they're viewed. That's how nature is viewed. That's how our environments are viewed, as material. And Marimba Ani talks about this. I didn't make notes on this point, but she talks about how nature is seen as just material, desacralized. You know, they deny spirit, and then everything around us is just seen as stuff, some physical stuff to just get hold of and you know, create more. I mean, yeah, create wealth, more and more wealth, and so on. So yeah, that's that. And then everything is politics. Yes. So everything is politics says apparently that's why platonic is meant to be the opposite of pederasty. Which really? Oh gosh, wow, yeah. So a platonic relationship. Anyway, yeah. I mean, that's a whole subject matter in and of itself that I'm trying not to get my head too into that right now. And then Tito District family, you said that I got a couple of books from Vandana Shiva. I hope they're the ones expressing the ideas you're discussing here. Yeah, I can't remember the book that I had from her was written with somebody else, and it was a really, really, really good book. Frankly, really good. And again, that whole area of nature and the environment is an area I really, really want to get into as well, because I think it's very under discussed in our kind of Pan-African circles. I'd suggest. So yeah, thanks guys. Keep the comments coming. I'll come back to those. Product placement there. Sorry, inadvertent. Highland Springs. Anyway, cool. All right. So that's it. We'll talk about love. Western, you know, European culture. Love is just alien to European culture because love requires things that Europeans, the ultima waza, the asili of European thought, you know, basically removes the possibility of love, just as it removes the possibility of altruism and so on, because of the lack of identification and the opposition to actually identifying with others. So where are we? Nearly done, actually. Just not many sections to go. And then here we go. Where are we? Sorry. Where are we? All right. So the next thing that really jumped out at me in this chapter was Marimba Ani's discussion or situating fear at the heart of the Europeans' relationships with each other, fear and others, but even to each other. And she argues that the European self is necessarily materialistic because it is shut off from the human value that comes from emotional connection and identification. So this the European self, as defined by Plato and others, thus needs to go and find value and peace and love in material things, but it can never find those love and peace in material things, and it knows, and Europeans know this, which is why we have the psycho-spiritual crises that we have in European society. So on page 380, Marimba Ani puts it this way. She says, a self that must be distinct in order to know becomes emotionally a self that perceives value in terms of itself in isolation. This is not the natural context for the creation of human value, which is normally created out of shared emotional commitment. The values of the European individual are, therefore, necessarily material. They are not true human values. Such a self is alone, afraid, defensive, and aggressive. Acquisitiveness, fanatical accumulation, and mutual exploitation are merely the logical and rational outgrowths of such a perception of reality. Because of the conception of self, the values of a European-defined individuality and freedom that the culture generates, the personality strives for a security not provided for, but in his culture, in an area from which it can never come. Material accumulation becomes the tool of an assurance against the hostilities and attacks of others. The individual becomes obsessed with the negative and threatening possibilities of the future, with accident and with death. He lives in a culture diseased with thanatophobia, which is fear of death, and one that provides him with insurances against every kind of physical or material possibility imaginable, yet knowing that no amount of financial gain can redeem his soul. So, yeah, that is the thing that we all, I would probably imagine that we all experience this fear, this fear, because this capitalism, Marimba Ani talks about capitalism and talks about Protestantism, which helped to shape capitalism, and about how, obviously these societies now that are shaped by these modes of being, all that we have left are getting more stuff, getting more money, getting more this, getting more that, getting more clothes, getting this, and then people sometimes wonder why it is that very rich people do things like commit suicide or do crazy stuff, not realizing that material wealth is in no way, is not necessarily anyway, correlated with happiness and wellness. Because anyway, I won't keep repeating it, but happiness, wellness comes from love and identification and emotional attachment and so on and so forth. All of those things are precluded. They're prevented from occurring in the European asili. And then what she talks about there is, the fear of the future is such an important one. She's talked about that already with the whole point about linear time, the European concept of linearity, where everything is going in this straight line like this, different to our, African concepts of time, which, yes, we understand that there is the profane time, which is just going along like that, but there's also the sacred time, the eternity, which we experience and which we engage and connect with through ritual drama and so on and so forth, ancestral communion and whatnot. And so I don't know if is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? I don't know if it's this section, but there's a Marimba Ani makes a point that it's because of our culture's emphasis on and because our cultures provide the ability to engage with eternity, to engage with sacred time, to transfer ourselves into sacred time. It's because of that we are not that scared about death generally. As Black people, African people, we're not that scared about death. Death does not hold the same terror as it does toward the European, but yeah, stripped of all of that, these Europeans, unfortunately for them, and for us, frankly, unfortunately, they're stripped of that, and so they're in this like fearful place all the time, terrified of what's going to happen, terrified about what's going to come in future. Even our whole, these societies are, if you look at politics, so much of politics is about, this terrible thing is going to come in future. Are we, population bomb, or the environment, the climate change is going to destroy the world. There's only 2 years left to save the world. All of this fear about the future. Fear drives politics basically in the world. And obviously world politics is basically determined and shaped by Europeans, and so they've just infected the rest of us with this horrendous terror. And then where are we? Yeah, page 3, 7a. Hang on a second. In concrete, 388. Sorry. Yeah. hang on, in concrete terms again. Oh, sorry, there's a paragraph here. I can't remember where I got this. I can't remember where I got this from. Sorry, but yeah, just a little bit more on this materialism and this never-ending desire for, to try and find peace in material things. Marimba Ani says this. European behavior is characterized by the overt striving for material possessions which symbolize value. The desired possession of these objects acts to motivate the individual in the culture in a way that non-material objectives do not. Material gain is a more powerful factor in determining behavior than achievements such as spiritual fulfillment and love for Europeans in this European, ideology. What is both ironic and tragic for Europeans is that their ultimate non-rational concern is indeed with spiritual fulfillment, but they have been deluded by the presuppositions of their cultural tradition into looking for it in the wrong places. They have been taught to erroneously and superficially resolve the basic conflict between the will to power and the will to love in a fanatical and inordinately destructive will to power. In this warped vision, to have power means that love is not necessary. And of course, it is precisely love that they need and actually seek. The cycle is endless, and they are placed on a treadmill, striving for what they can never achieve, for completion of self, Yurugu. And the only thing that does progress in a linear direction and does not resolve is the destruction of the human spirit. And all of this stuff, this really makes me think about the people that I come across in a work setting. Lots of people, succeeding, they're really good at their jobs, they're really good apparatchiks in whatever government departments they're in or whatever corporate departments they're in, and so on and so on. And I want to become this, I want to become that, I want to become this, become that. But there's a hole in the middle that's just empty and cannot be filled. There's a hole in the middle of all of us as we lose ourselves into our careers, into our jobs, into our trades, into our whatever, this, that, and the other hobbies, and so on and so forth. All the while that's happening, the destruction of the spirit is progressing, is getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's such a shame that, I don't know, the worse things become, the more arrogant and cocky everything seems to become. So, we're getting more and more, we're becoming more and more comfortable in this decline. We don't seem to realize that it's the decline. It's a decline. The more detached we become from one another, the worse it gets. And then, there's one more thing here. Marimba Ani makes this damning indictment of European culture here. She says on page 381, she says, it is at the same, so European culture is the only culture that provides little or no source of spiritual or emotional well-being for its members. It carries little tradition of insight into the human spirit and virtually no knowledge of the human soul. It is atrophied toward non-human realities, i.e. has no idea of how to even engage with non-human realities, i.e. the rest of the cosmos. European culture presents the individual it produces with only the alternatives of materialism, scientism, and rationalism, when what she needs is the inner peace that comes from communion with others, the sense of oneness and emotional identification with other people. What she needs is love. So there you go. I just felt... so everything was politics. You said that's a beautiful, the first paragraph we read, that's a beautiful paragraph. It also speaks to our obsession with class, for example. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's sad, actually. It's very sad. Well, I must say that reading this whole chapter, I've nearly finished my summary, but reading this whole chapter, I definitely get the sense from Marimba Ani that she has a fair amount of sympathy or empathy toward the European, because she speaks about all of this. She speaks about this stuff, and she speaks about it as a tragedy. Actually, she speaks about it as tragic that Europeans are so cut off from spiritual wellness and healing, so cut off from love. She calls it a tragedy, and I think many people who talk about Marimba Ani probably would talk about her and consider her to be like, I don't know, just completely an open, anti-European or whatever. But I really, the more I read this book, I see her as very humanistic, if you want to put it that way. She views Europeans as people like the rest of us who have just been battered and shaped by this asili. And she speaks, for example, about biocultural, the European as a biocultural being, and it's almost like she's saying it's tragic that they manifest all of this in the ways that they are, and they're cut adrift. There's one section she talks about how Europeans who do not go along with this asili, Europeans who are not bought into all of this individualism and so forth, and who are motivated by love and whatnots and so on. They have to go completely against the grain of their culture in a way that Marimba Ani basically says she's not sure if it's even possible, if such a person can even exist. Last time around, we talked about how, you've got to be very careful with regard to liberals, European lefties and liberals, progressives, quote unquote. But it's an open question for me, actually. It's a fascinating conversation or element to be in this book. The European themselves as victim, the European as victim of European ideology and European behavior. I would imagine, to be honest, I think Europeans would gain a lot from reading this book, because this isn't really a book about Africa or African people. It's a book about them. And I don't know if many Europeans have really held a mirror up to themselves culturally to look closely and consider what they are, who they are and what they are. I'm not sure if they ever do that, because obviously, you can't have Europeans doing that willy-nilly, left, right, and center, if they're planning on continuing to destroy, to rule and dominate the world. So yeah, Paul Morris, shout out to you, my brother. You said, I think it's really important to tackle that is European notions of what is the quote unquote mind. They view the mind as an instrument, as a weapon. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And this Plato and these mans there, man, they were just, and the followers of Plato, they're just skullduggerous, skullduggerous, because they're the ones who came up with this concept of the mind as being a weapon. And obviously it's a weapon. It's a weapon because it's better than everyone else, and it must destroy and so forth. And then Paul, you said as well that, with all respect, they are aware of the tragedy and that drives them. Yeah, I think, for the vast majority, and that's the thing. It'll be rare to meet many Europeans who are unaware of the tragedy, and even those who are aware and who hand-wring about it and feel sorry about it and so forth. I don't know. Maybe once we really start to delve deep into the layers of the European ideology and the cultural forms of thinking and ultima wazo, I wonder, because it must be quite painful. It would be quite painful to really drill into it and this is terrible, terrible. I don't know. But maybe there's some Europeans watching. If they are, let me know your thoughts, man. Let me know your thoughts on this point. So yeah, that's just something that I just wanted to mention. Now, there's a few things that I did skip over in this. I'm not going to cover in detail. The last thing I want to talk about is violence and the need for violence in this European culture. Yeah, so I'll come back to this in a second, actually, because that is pertinent to. Actually, we'll talk about it now. We're talking about how Europeans and what their mindset might be with regard to all of this, and everything as politics said. They can't seem to stop. They probably perceive that as defeat. Yeah. Well, I think have we talked about it already? That actually, where are we? Yeah. Well. The fact of the matter, let me talk about it here. Yeah. So on page 381, this will be the last section that I'll do in this section. I've said a few times before that in the writings of Marimba Ani and also in the writings of Baba Amos Wilson, I see Afro-pessimists foreshadowings. They were writing before Frank Wilderson and others kind of, came up with the term Afro-pessimism. But Frank Wilderson always makes the point that Afro-pessimism is not some new thing. Afro-pessimism is merely continuing what Africans have been saying for millennia, actually. Frank Wilderson says something like the first, the Africans who were first enslaved by the Arabs in 14, whatever it is, they would have been the first Afro-pessimists, But you see this here on page 381 when Marimba Ani is talking about the need for violence in this European culture. She says, the characteristics we have discussed are basically those that determine European interpersonal behavior. I don't know if you can hear, by the way, there's fireworks in the distance here. It's a problem when you move out of London in the UK and you move to these like shires. It's Coronation Day today, and there are enough people around here who probably, there's flags, Union Jacks on the walls here and there, and it's just depressing. We've avoided most of it, thankfully, but there's fireworks. I don't know if you can hear it, but back to the point. The characteristics we have discussed are basically those that determine European interpersonal behavior. The institutions and forms of the culture can be understood as structured sets of rules that are based on these given norms and that act to regulate the behavior of individuals so that a support system for its intercultural behavior is maintained. Intercultural meaning between Europeans and other people. In other words, what accounts for the survival of the culture as a cohesive whole is its ideological objective of the control and subjugation of all other peoples and the related commitment to technological and material superiority. And Marimba Ani says, a friend of mine points out that Europeans would indeed destroy each other if they did not have others to destroy. By the same token, the integrative function of the culture could not have survived so long the disintegrative, that's a big word, tendencies of an individualistic ethic had it not been for the outwardly directed imperialistic objective and quest for world supremacy. That quest is definitive to the European ultima rojo, and the emotional satisfaction, itself a negation of spirit, with which members of European culture identify. And then there's one more section as well on page 379, which is pertinent to this. It says, it is difficult for Europeans to treat other Europeans non-aggressively. That is the source of moral behavioral tension. The superego, to borrow Freud's term, of the culture then instructs its members to direct unacceptable violent aggression toward non-cultural beings outside of the culture, communists, gooks, N-words, etc. On this level, the conflict is resolved. And then she talks about how violence, like you see in the movies, is not experienced as violence. Neither is violence that is directed at Africans in America. Anyway, the point being there that, oh, good. It wasn't too loud, thankfully. The point being there that, we're here talking about Europeans and, can some of them change? Can some of them kind of understand what's going on and change their ways? Marimba Ani is making the point that, listen, on a collective level, no, they cannot change. It cannot change. You know why? Because the individualism that's at the heart of the European culture is necessarily destructive. Society is breaking down. They're fighting each other. They're competing against each other. They're trying to outdo each other. They're trying to destroy their environment and so on. Their societies would collapse. The only thing that's keeping their societies from collapsing is that they can channel some of the worst excesses of their aggression and violence. They can channel that onto the black or onto the other. And this is perfectly in line with the Afro-pessimist argument that the black in the thought of others, non-blacks, the black stands as the non-human. And so you've got the humans here, humans relate to each other and so on and so forth, civil society, but the black, the slave, they say, must necessarily lie outside of the realm of human, outside of the bounds of human, and can thus be, is thus fair game for violence, bloodshed, slavery, and so forth. Again, I'll mention Saidiya Hartman, who talked about how the Europeans, enjoyed slavery and they would get sadistic pleasure from the torture and abuse and murder of our great ancestors. And what's his name? Calvin Warren as well. Calvin Warren, in his Ontological Terror, I've read a little bit of it and heard, a few interviews with him and lectures from him. He talks about how for the European and for others, the black stands in a position of nothingness, and so they can pour their venom, pour their aggression, pour their violence onto the black because the black is seen as nothing, and it's almost like a catharsis, almost like they can kind of just like let off steam by being so violent toward us and others. So that's just something that then connects us with the next chapter as well, because the next chapter is going to be about European behavior toward other people, the values that actually drive European behavior toward other people, and obviously that's a foreshadowing of it. That violence there is what characterizes. They need us. The Europeans need the non-European in order to keep the European from collapsing into itself and destroying itself, which is a somber note to kind of to finish up. But yeah, it's an important point. A couple of things that I missed out. I didn't talk. There's a long discussion about Protestantism in this chapter. Some of it kind of was probably a little, should have been in the religion chapter, in chapter was it 3? But one thing her overall point with regard to Protestantism was quite interesting. Marimba Ani argues that and Everything is Politics, just quickly before we go on, Everything is Politics said that that's the very reason we should be striving for self-determination, to minimize exposure to their psychic torment. Exactly. And Black thought must be founded upon this point right here. That doesn't preclude alliances and working together with others, but first and foremost, we've got to be driven by our own ideas, our own conceptions of existence, our own epistemology, our own spirituality, our own ontological concepts, and all that sort of stuff. And we have got to decide what we're doing. Don't be led by others, because they will just lead us down, lead us onto a roundabout that will just bring us right back to where we came from. She talks about Protestantism and talks about how one of the key differences between Protestantism and Catholicism is that Roman Catholicism, for all its imperialist, was very imperialistic, very outward focused. So Roman Catholicism merged with Romanism, or Christianity merged with Romanism, and it was all focused on the outward, the rhetorical ethic, and all about dominating and controlling other people and justifying the control of other people and so on. Whereas Protestantism was now coming in to fill a gap that Catholicism had kind of had. Marimba Ani argues that Catholicism didn't really have that much to say, that much discipline on how Europeans themselves would behave toward each other. It was mostly about how Europeans would behave toward others. Whereas Protestantism, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and others come in, and they're all about ruthlessly disciplining European behavior toward each other. So this is where you get the Protestant work ethic, the austerity. They stripped away all of the kind of sensory input that you get in Catholicism. Catholics are all about the incense and the cathedrals and the tapestries and all this and all that and the drink and the wine and The Protestants stripped all that back, said, nope, that's too, they were more Platonic. These Protestants were more Platonic. They were like, no, forget all that sensory stuff. No. You've got to work. You've got to go for self. You've got to work hard. You've got to accumulate, plan for the future, and, all that sort of stuff. So Marimba Ani basically argues that, Catholicism was was actually quite rich with sensory input, whereas Protestantism was very dour. Hence they're called the Puritans. The Puritans were kind of the flag bearers for this Protestantism, joyless, disciplined, harsh austerity, and so on and so forth. And then she argues that actually the Protestantism is deeply unspiritual because it's very, very materialistic and so on. So that was somewhat of an interesting point that she talked about with regard to Protestantism. But yeah, I didn't want to go into too much detail on that because it wasn't one of the main things that kind of jumped out to me. So yes, that will be that for now. Thanks guys for joining. I hope you've found it an interesting and another. I hope some of the stuff that I pulled out in this was some of the stuff that you pulled out if you read the book yourselves. And yeah, we shall of course continue with the next chapter on another occasion. Now, what I want to do before you go, I just want to give you a heads up of next week's live stream, which is going to be at the same time next week, and it's going to be we're going to take a pause from covering Yurugu so that we can talk about a subject which I'm very interested in, and I'm sure you'll be interested in as well, relating to ancient Kemet. And this is the video here. Hopefully you can see this on screen. This is there's no background there. Sorry about that. But this is there we go. How do I make this? Anyway, yeah. This is the subject, the Kemetic roots of African people, and I'm going to be joined by a special guest called Kamjiverse. This is a brother who I've only just recently become aware of, and where are we? That's not working. Yeah, he's been putting out some excellent videos, some excellent video discussions about the Kemetic roots of African people, the African roots of Kemet, and various other things. And one of the things that he's done that's really piqued my interest is talking about how West Africans in particular, but also East Africans, can derive much of their roots, their heritage, their ancestry from ancient Kemet. And this is, you're looking at linguistics, archaeology, genetics, and so on and so forth. West Africans, we're talking about your Yoruba, your Igbo, all these various other groups. And the reason I'm doing this, doing this conversation with him is because I feel that, let me come back, let me move that on. I feel that when we're talking about African culture, African philosophy, and so forth, sometimes we can get a little bit bogged down into the things that are different, the specific culturally, this local traditions and customs and so forth. Yoruba culture, Igbo culture, Hausa culture, Fulani culture. Why is it all Nigerian? Congo, the Bakongo culture, the Zulu culture, the Baganda culture, the and so on and so forth. And we can sometimes miss the wood for the trees, meaning that we can sometimes forget that we are one people. Yes, we don't all live in exactly the same ways, but we are one people. We are African people. We are Black people. We are a Pan-African people. And what I love about this brother Kamjiverse is that he's going into that in detail, and he's showing that actually this great ancient civilization of Kemet was, yes, an Black African civilization. Hopefully you all know that. Sheikh Anta Diop and various others have made that clear. But not only that, the peopling of West Africa, for a start, came from the Nile Valley, came from ancient Kemet through the Sahel and Sudan regions into West Africa. And then also even the people in East Africa and Southern Africa also owe their origins to the people of ancient Kemet. My people, the Bagisu people, for example, we have traditions that we came from up north, from Misri, from Egypt. And then just to top that all off as well, the ancient Kamau themselves told us many millennia ago that they came from the source of the rivers of the Nile. They came from the mountains of the moon, where the god Hapi dwelt. So ancient Kemet, probably far from being like this this historical thing that isn't really that important. Studying ancient Kemet and studying ancient Africa holds the key to a really important key to us as Black people, understanding and recognizing that we are one people and that we all come from the same roots. So that's going to be next weekend, next Saturday at the same time, around about 8 p.m. UK time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please join there. I've put a link to the video there in the comments there. So just please go there and click notify and like the video as well, if you would. And also I'll put a link to the guys to Kamjiverse's video channel as well, so you can start doing some early advanced reading. Some early advanced study into that. But that's going to be next Saturday, the 13th of May. We're going to talk about the Kemetic roots of African people. And then we're going to do the week after that, on the 20th of May, Saturday 20th of May, we come back for chapter 8 of Yurugu. And guys, we are nearly finished this book now. We've only got chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10 left, and then the conclusion. So, wow. Really got to get a move on with deciding what book we're gonna study next. Give some suggestions in the comments and elsewhere if you could. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Everything is politics. I hope to see you next week. Thank you, much appreciated. Medasi. To the rest of y'all's, have a wonderful rest of the evening. I'm gonna probably just brush my teeth and go to bed pretty much after this. So it's been a pleasure. All right. Peace and blessings to each and every single one of you. Hope you're able to get away from this coronation nonsense. And I will see you next week, hopefully. All right. Salama.